Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Princeton AI Alignment and Safety Seminar, or PASS in short. PASS is a virtual and collaborative space for diverse researchers to learn and discuss how to align increasingly capable AI models for safe behavior. I'm Yang Sibo, and I will be hosting today's session with Sadika and Professor Sanjeev Arora. The seminar will be 1 hour long, and we will be live streaming that on YouTube. During the session, you are welcome to post your questions or comments on the YouTube chat. You are also welcome to join our mailing list and follow us on Twitter to get notified of speakers and live stream links. You can find the links in the live stream chat. Today, we are very excited to have Jacob Steinhardt from UC Berkeley join us. Jacob is assistant professor at Berkeley, and his research goal is to make the conceptual advances necessary for machine learning systems to be reliable and to be aligned with human values. Today, he will be talking about interpretability and decomposition. Without further ado, let's welcome Jacob.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here. So I'm going to be talking mostly about some recent work with Yossi Gandelsman and Alyosha Efros on interpreting CLIP's image representation via text-based decomposition. This will also be presented at iClear, but we'll get to go into a lot more depth here. And also talk about some ongoing work. So the kind of overall motivation here is we want to do interpretability, meaning that we want to understand what's going on in the latent representations of models. And why do we want to do this? Well, there's lots of reasons, but in particular, interpretability can help us to better understand models, which can help us to do things like predict their behavior out of distribution, repair models, and do lots of other cool things that a kind of growing literature has shown we can do. But we need ways to scale these interpretability techniques to large models. And so in this work, I'm going to show one way that we can do this, where we analyze the CLIP model, which is one of the main models used for text and vision understanding. We'll analyze it via some algorithms we'll introduce to automatically decompose its representations. And then we'll use this understanding to improve its performance. So let me show you more concretely the sort of thing we're going to do. So first, we're going to try to understand how different directions in the activation space of specific model components affect the final representation. So for instance, you might have this input of a purse that I'm showing here, and so CLIP has lots of different attention heads, and these different attention heads actually specialize in different tasks that we'll discover using our methods. And so, maybe one of these heads is about animals, and it points in the tiger direction because this looks kind of like a tiger. One of these is about texture, it points in the polka dots direction. And then one is kind of just saying what sort of object is this, and it's probably either a purse or a bag. And these all kind of get added up to the final representation. So this is one thing we're going to do. This is one type of decomposition, this kind of decomposition into components. But another is actually into locations in the image. So in terms of deciding whether this is, say, a bag or a tiger, it could be that different locations have different effects. And again, these kind of all get added together in the final representation. And so we're going to understand both this kind of spatial decomposition and this component-wise decomposition to better understand CLIP's representations. And why would we want to do this? I kind of gave some motivation already, but more concretely, beyond just understanding the structure, this is going to let us identify and fix spurious cues in the model. One actual kind of fun one that we found is there's this attention head that has to do with numbers. It kind of looks at how much of something there is in an image. But we actually found that this attention head does two things at once. It both counts how many distinct objects are in an image, but it also recognizes the actual symbolic number. So it both says there's 3 objects and it recognizes the number 3. And so because the same head is doing both of these tasks, you can actually create interference patterns like this image, where if you have 3 people all with the number 6 on their shirt, and you ask CLIP how many people it has, it actually thinks there's 6 people because of this kind of interference. So that, and I'll show kind of more sophisticated applications of this later in the talk. Another thing we can do with this spatial decomposition is attribution and localization, right? So if we have this image, there's, multiple things that are true about this image. It's both a photo of a pyramid and a photo of a camel. But by kind of, decomposing into different locations in the image, we can actually see what parts of the image make Clip think that it's a pyramid versus a camel, and we can kind of see that it's doing something that sort of makes sense. And we'll actually see later that that this actually kind of gives state-of-the-art results at localizing objects in images. And then finally, if we know what different components of the model are constructing different components of the representation, we can actually use this for property-specific retrieval, right? So say I, again, have this purse input image. If I just did nearest neighbors to this image in the overall Clip representation, I would get a bunch of, purses with this kind of polka dot pattern. But maybe I actually want to just look at similarity across, some more specific axis. Like maybe I want things that are similar objects, or maybe I want things that are similar animals, even though this isn't actually an animal. And we can actually do this by identifying which heads kind of, capture different subspaces that we care about. So these are the kind of things that we can do with these decompositions. And having kind of motivated that, I want to tell you, okay, how do we do this, and what are the actual results? So in this work, there's actually 3 key claims that we'll establish, and at least each of the last 2 claims are going to help us do some cool applications. So the first claim is that Clip's output is actually primarily generated by its attention heads as opposed to by its MLP layers. I'll say more about what that means in a second. The second claim is that these attention heads, actually, we can decompose their contribution to the output as a 3-dimensional sum. And then by looking at terms in that sum, we can attribute things to specific positions or components in the model. And then finally, we'll kind of zoom into specific heads and see that they create task-specific subspaces, which lets us handle these issues of spurious cues and also do this task-specific retrieval. Any questions before I jump in? Okay, great. So let me start with this first part, that Clip's output is generated by attention heads. I need to first explain to you a lot more about the Clip architecture before we can understand this. So first of all, what is Clip? So Clip is a model that takes either as input an image I or text T, and then embeds this into some latent representation. Actually, unlike traditional transformers, it doesn't then produce a final output. It just is an embedding model. So it just creates representations. But then it's used as the backbone of many other things like stable diffusion or vision language models or other stuff that want to be able to have text and images in the same latent space. And in this work, we're mainly going to focus on the image encoder part of Clip. So I've shown right here what this kind of looks like. So what happens is we have some input image, like this purse image. We kind of split it up into a bunch of patches that we think of as tokens. So in the same way that in a language model, you would have kind of tokens for each part of the sentence, now we have these kind of image tokens. And we also have a special token called the class token, which is what we're going to later read out from to create our embedding. So then what happens with these tokens? Well, just like in a traditional transformer, they just get passed through a bunch of layers. These layers are either multi-head self-attention layers, or attention, which are these things with all the attention heads here, or they're multi-layer perceptron layers. That's these MLPs. And the kind of main important thing that matters is that this is a residual architecture. So basically, each time we have a new component, it kind of just adds some vector to the representation. And so each time this arrow kind of comes back in, it's just adding to what's already there. And the final thing is a sum across all of these different components. And so what you get at the end is actually a bunch of activations at each token position. But as I said, we're only going to read out from this class token, and we pass it through a projection matrix P that then kind of transforms things into this joint image text space. So this is kind of the overall CLIP architecture. And so the main takeaway I want you to have from this slide is basically this additive structure, that if we say, okay, what does CLIP do given an image I? Well, it applies this projection P to the output of this vision transformer. And this vision transformer is basically some constant term plus a sum across all of the layers of the contribution of that layer to the output. Now, this contribution, could be very nonlinear, and it can depend on all of the components that came before it. But this sum structure is going to be the first thing that helps us to decompose things. So the thing you want to remember here is that if we look at just the direct effects on the output, they decompose additively across layers. And this idea actually has been used before in other contexts. There's an idea called the logit lens that was introduced by Nostalgibraist in 2020, and then later developed by others such as Dar et al. And Belrose et al. That kind of decomposes this for models that have logits at the end, whereas we're kind of generalizing this to do this decomposition just for an embedding model. So once we have this decomposition, well, the simplest thing to do is to just figure out which layers here actually matter. And something that's actually quite interesting is that only a very small number of layers matter in terms of what they're writing to the output. So we can ablate the layers progressively by basically just replacing a term with just its mean value so that it doesn't depend on the input at all. And what we find is for different sizes of CLIP models, basically until you are at like the final 4 layers, you can ablate pretty much everything and have almost no change in performance. And what's even more interesting is you can actually ablate every single MLP layer and have almost no change in performance. So basically, the only thing that matters in terms of constructing the final representation is these last 4 attention layers. Now, the other layers do important work, but the point is all of that work is mediated by these 4 attention layers. So they're kind of all doing a bunch of scratch work. They're kind of building things up, but they're not writing anything directly to the output. It's all kind of in the null space of this projection matrix P. And it's only these last 4 layers that actually write directly to the output. And so we're going to focus in this work on these 4 attention layers. So that kind of brings us to part 2, this idea that we can decompose attention heads, right? So again, remember that from part 1, we have, first of all, that CLIP applied to an image I is this projection matrix times this sum. And that we can also ignore the MLP layers, because if we just ablate them all, the output has pretty much the same level of quality. So I'm just going to focus on this attention term here. So if we look at a single attention layer, which I'll denote by attention L of the image I, first of all, what is it actually a function of? So it's a function of the image I, but it depends on it only through the activations of this vision transformer. In particular, this attention layer only depends on the previous layer's activations, and then it kind of uses those activations to decide what to attend to, and then to pull activations out and write them to the next layer. And we can actually decompose this further, where it's a sum over the different attention heads in the attention layer, and a sum over the image patches in the image of the attention of that head to patch I times the OV matrix. This is like some parameter matrix of the attention head, times the activations at patch I. So basically we're, doing this doubly nested sum across heads and image patches of attending to the patch and then pulling that activation. And so what this means is that actually we can write clip as, some constant plus this kind of triply nested sum, CILH, where CILH is just this term, the attention times the activation times this projection matrix P times the OV matrix. So basically, we can write it as a sum of contributions where each contribution comes from some specific patch I, head H, and layer L. So this is really nice, right? Because, traditionally, we just have this model that is kind of like arbitrarily nonlinear and everything, depends on everything. But what I'm actually saying here is that actually things decompose additively and we can attribute things back to specific patches and heads. And so this is the kind of 3D sum composition that I was claiming. And so why is this useful? Well, one immediate application of this is attribution, right? So I'm going to abuse notation from here on out and ignore the fact that this is approximate and ignore the fact that there's a constant term and just say, okay, clip applied to an image I is just this sum of these individual contributions. So, if we just abuse notation that way, first of all, we can try grouping these by position, right? So for a single image patch, I can just collect all of the contributions for that image patch by summing across all of the layers and heads. This gives the total contribution of a patch I to the output. And so we can use this to do kind of attribution heat maps. And so I'm showing you some examples here. How do we do the attribution heat map? Well, we just take the dot product of this contribution CI, which is some representation, with the clip embedding of some text. So in this case, an image of an echidna. And this kind of tells us, okay, which patches in the image make clip most think that this is an image of an echidna. And this works pretty well, right? So we can compare this, first of all, to something like just the raw attention map in clip. And it works way better than the raw attention map. Why is that? Well, basically, this is like weighting the attention map by how much the stuff it's attending to actually writes in the direction we care about. And so the raw attention is kind of like only capturing one term, whereas this captures both of those terms. It also works better than some more sophisticated methods like GradCam and recent other work trying to solve this attribution problem, at least qualitatively, right? Like it's kind of looking at the right things. These other things are kind of a bit more patchy and random. And I think the reason why it's working better is because we really are just seeing what is the model doing, like what is it intrinsically doing, how is it building up the representation, and just reading out that structure rather than kind of imposing our own beliefs on what the model should be doing. But that's very qualitative. So can we kind of quantitatively measure how good these attribution maps are? And the answer is yes. So the idea is that we can turn attribution scores into segmentation masks by just binarizing them, right? We can just like pick some threshold and say that everything above that threshold is kind of, the foreground object that we're trying to segment, and everything below that threshold is the background. And this is a pretty standard technique for turning attribution scores into segmentations and evaluating them. And so we evaluate on this data set called ImageNet segmentation, which consists of about 4,200 images from ImageNet with annotated segmentations. And so if we compare to kind of all of the other zero-shot segmentation methods in the literature, we find that we're actually state-of-the-art on pretty much any metric that you could care about. So, we're better than GradCam, we're better than these other things like rollout and partial RLP. This actually just seems to, at least for zero-shot segmentation, get state-of-the-art. And so this is pretty cool because we set out to do interpretability and to understand what's going on, but then we just got this kind of state-of-the-art method for free. So this is kind of the, the first sign that there's something interesting going on here. But we haven't really gotten into the understanding part of what is Clip actually doing. And so that's what I want to talk about in part 3. And so here we're going to look at individual attention heads and see that they kind of actually specialize in specific tasks. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's just return back to this decomposition. Right, so we once again have this triply nested sum that Clip's output is this sum over individual patches and components. So now instead of grouping by the patch, we're going to group by components. So we'll group by attention head. So we'll say the contribution of head H in layer L is just the sum over all patches of the contribution of that patch to head H in layer L. Right, so now this gives us for any given input, it tells us how much each component of the model contributes to the output. But now we need to do something with that because this is just some, some random high dimensional vector. How can we actually interpret these contributions? And so the idea here is now we're going to actually exploit the fact that Clip is not just an image model, but also a text model. And we're going to kind of automatically find a basis for each head where each basis element is labeled with text. And so then, given some activation, we can decompose it into that basis and say, okay, well, this is 0.7 times this text interpretable direction plus 0.2 times this text interpretable direction, and so on. So how does this work? So the algorithm is this algorithm that we developed that we call text span. So what do we do? Well, first we just get some big data set of examples, and we compute for a single head these head contributions CLH across this data set. And so these are going to be a bunch of vectors that lie in this joint image text space for a Clip. Then we want some way of describing these. So we're going to generate just some large library of text embeddings. Find some long list of descriptions of visual concepts. We use GPT-4 to help us generate this, but we get this big library of text, and then we embed all of these text directions also in this space. And now we're going to basically do something like PCA. So we're going to find the text direction that explains the most variance of these outputs. So that kind of points closest to the biggest direction of variation. In this case, it turned out to be the color yellow. And then we just keep going, right? So we find the next text direction that explains the most remaining variance that's kind of orthogonal to the first vector. Maybe that's an image with triangles. And then we just keep going until we've kind of explained most of the total variation in these outputs. And it turns out that with around maybe about 70 of these dimensions per head, we can actually explain most of the total variance in the model. So for instance, if you project just onto those directions, then you get still a very high accuracy on ImageNet. So what we end up with is basically just this list of axis directions in text for each head. And here's kind of some of the results you get. So if you look at these are 3 randomly selected heads. And I'm showing you the top 6 principal components that are found by this text span algorithm. So it turns out for layer 23, head 7, the biggest direction of variation is in the direction of a paddle. And then you see these things, which actually are not exactly paddles, but are kind of paddle-like. The next biggest orthogonal direction is a ladder. You get a bunch of ladders, intriguing and enigmatic passageway, a bowl, a table, a shoelace. And I think the main thing to point out here is, most of these are pretty reasonable. There's some that are not so great, like a magnolia has like sharks. It's not really clear why magnolia is giving you sharks. But generally this is pretty reasonable. Another kind of interesting finding, though, is that many heads actually seem to specialize in very specific roles. So if you look at layer 21, head 11, and you look at the top 5 principal components, they're photo captured in the Arizona desert, picture taken in Alberta, Canada, photo taken in Brazil, picture taken in Cyprus, photo taken in Seoul, South Korea. And so these are just like all different locations. There's another one that is basically counting, image with 6 subjects, image with 4 people. And this is where we get the spurious cue that I mentioned. It also has an image of the number 3, an image of the number 10, the number 15. And then there's this other one that is about letters, right? So these heads have these kind of specialized subspaces. And this isn't any structure that we imposed on it. It just kind of comes out this way, right? Actually, if anything, we impose the opposite structure in that we kind of are enforcing that these directions be orthogonal to each other in this text span algorithm. And even with this orthogonalization, we're actually finding these very similar roles. And this it's not necessarily every head that does this, but there's quite a few, right? There's also this colors head, an animals head, an objects head, a textures head, a shapes head, a locations head that is more about like settings rather than geolocations. And so, I think the main really interesting finding here is that it turns out these heads specialize into these interpretable subspaces. And I think this is really interesting because this is a kind of advantage of this very like scalable kind of automated top-down approach to interpretability. A lot of interpretability research focuses on just like picking one mechanism and understanding it in a lot of detail. And I think that's also quite valuable, but it has the potential of losing the forest for the trees, right? Like if you're just looking at one of these mechanisms, you wouldn't notice that there's this kind of head specialization. You kind of have to actually look at everything that's going on in the head. So that is kind of qualitative understanding, but can we actually, use this to do anything useful? And so one thing we can do is we can use our understanding of these heads to remove spurious cues. So there's this kind of commonly used data set called the Waterbirds data set, which is used for handling spurious cues. So basically it has a bunch of different birds that either live in the water or on land, and then that either have a water background or a land background, right? So there's kind of ones where the cue matches the class, where there's like a water bird on water and a land bird on land, but there's also ones where there's a water bird on land or a land bird on water. And so so we can classify this with clip zero shot by just giving looking at whether the text embedding of an image aligns more with the text water bird or land bird. This is kind of the standard way of evaluating this. And by default, if you do this, you don't do very well. So that's these kind of numbers here. In fact, they're actually slightly below chance. And so to kind of, fix this, we want to remove this spurious cue. How do we do this? Well, we found what all these heads are doing using this text span algorithm. So we're just going to ablate the heads that are related to geolocation, location, or background, because those are the heads that pay attention to this cue that we don't actually want to use. If we do this, we see like pretty big improvements, especially for this middle model. We have almost like a 30-point gain. To show that this is like not just because getting rid of heads at random is useful. We deleted an equal number of random heads, and we took the best out of, I think, 10 different trials, and that's what this middle column shows. And, we're doing much better than if we picked heads kind of at random. So this is kind of cool. It shows, first of all, that this understanding is pointing to something real, that if we ablate the stuff that we think relates to the spurious queue, it actually does reduce the spurious queue. I think it also just like shows that interpretability can potentially be useful, which I think is important. Another kind of more qualitative application is property-specific retrieval. So this is a thing I mentioned before where, okay, if we know what each head does, then if we have an input image and we want to retrieve images that are similar according to a specific property, then we can just do nearest neighbors in the representation space of that particular head, right? Like we have this contribution that we already found of the contribution of that head. We can do nearest neighbors on that representation instead of on the total representation. And so you get kind of cool things like this, this input image here, where it's kind of this optical illusion of like, a cup, but also two faces. If you do nearest neighbors according to the counting head, it gives you other images with two objects. If you do it according to this object head, it gives you other cups. And if you do it according to a color head, it gives you things with this like black and white pattern. Similarly, like if you do this with this kind of puffer fish, the location head just shows you things in the same location. The color head shows you yellow things. The texture head shows you things with this like polka dot pattern. So this kind of, further shows that these heads really do specialize, and that the way in which they specialize is the way that our text span descriptions are claiming. We could also put this all together, right? So I talked about this decomposition into different heads, or earlier in the talk, these different image locations. But you can just do both at once. So for each head, we can ask which image locations help build up the representation of that head. And then we can use these text span descriptions also to understand how it builds up different components of that representation. So for instance, layer 22 head 1 is this shape head. It cares about isosceles triangles. We can look at that for this kind of pyramid example, and it turns out like, these pyramids are recognized as isosceles triangles. And this color head, these camels are kind of orange, and it kind of looks at those camels for image with an orange color. And so this is, I think, more for just qualitative understanding, but it helps us, really understand how these different components are building up the final representation. I also want to talk about some ongoing work. So this is kind of building on this idea of, can we find how different components create the final representation? So remember that I told you that the MLPs don't directly do anything to the final representation. It's all mediated by the attention heads. So that's true, but we could still ask, what do the MLPs do, at least indirectly? Now, the simplest way to do that would be to just like ablate the MLPs and see what happens. It turns out this is actually not a very effective strategy, because there's a lot of redundant mechanisms in neural nets. And if you ablate one thing, other stuff kind of tends to turn on to take over for it. So what you really want to do is you want to say, okay, what is like this MLP like actually writing to, and like how is that affecting the output? Now, it's not directly affecting the output at all. We already saw that, but it's writing to these attention heads, which do affect the output. And so we can kind of do a kind of second order version of this technique that I described in this talk. I'm not going to go into the full details of how that second order method works, but it basically gives us a way to say for each neuron in each of the MLP layers of CLIP, what is it writing to the output? And it turns out most of these neurons kind of write multiple things. It's kind of polysemantic, but it's not that polysemantic. There's maybe like 10 or so things that each neuron does. And so we can build kind of this library of, for every neuron, a kind of decomposition of it into the main concepts that it's tracking. Why is this useful? Well, it actually lets us identify these spurious cues in like a much more fine-grained way. And that's what I'm showing here. So these are all kind of adversarial examples for CLIP, but they're not adversarial examples in the traditional sense of, you know, someone picked like special like L infinity perturbations and like, you know, changed each pixel in some really like subtle way. They're actually semantic adversarial examples. So I didn't really have any fine-grained control over how this image was generated. I actually just put some text into Stable Diffusion and got the output. So as an example, this is you know, an image of a horse that gets misclassified as automobile. What was put into Stable Diffusion? It's a horse is driven by a trucker on a road with a sign saying emissions in the background. And in fact, if you do this kind of spatial attribution to see what it's paying attention, like what's causing it to think that it's an automobile, it's actually this emission sign, and also this trucker, but not the horse. In fact, the horse is in the opposite direction of automobile towards horse. So, and you can kind of see this in other cases as well. So this is a dog is running through a fishery, chasing after a squirrel and a rabbit, while this with a scenic view of the surrounding forests. Stable Diffusion isn't that smart, so it ignores most of this, but it does have a dog and a rabbit. And somehow the rabbit makes CLIP think that this is an image of a deer instead of an image of a dog. Okay, and so what's kind of like going on with these examples? Well, basically, again, this is kind of a simplification, but we can just kind of find all of the neurons that that have to do with automobiles, right? And those neurons are polysemantic. They respond to multiple things. And so we can look for all of the other things other than automobiles that they also respond to. And if we put enough of those into the image, then it will incorrectly think it's an automobile, even though there's no automobile in the image. And sometimes these are like spurious cues that make a lot of sense, right? It makes sense that an emission sign and a trucker are going to be correlated with automobile, or maybe that like you know, rabbits are correlated with deers. There's others that are like pretty weird, right? So it's really unclear why a poodle wearing a ring should have anything to do with birds. And sometimes it really is just random. Sometimes it actually has to do with the text representation. So I think, for instance, like violets and violins kind of collision with each other because they share a common token in the CLIP tokenizer. But it kind of doesn't matter where these come from because we can just find them automatically, right? We just kind of label all of these neurons. We find the things that clash with the concept that we're trying to trick the model about, and then we add those to the image. And so then you can kind of mass produce these adversarial examples. And I mean, one, I just think this is cool, but two, you know, this helps us really understand the kind of strengths and weaknesses of CLIP as a model. And it really shows that, again, like this like understanding we claim to be getting from interpretability is real and not fake, right? Like we wouldn't be able to construct these examples if this labeling didn't really work. So to kind of summarize, I think just this idea of like decompositions plus kind of doing some automated like AI assisted interpretation of what you get out of the decompositions is a really powerful tool that can help us to really scale up interpretability. And this kind of top-down analysis where we're really trying to understand everything in the model rather than just like one specific mechanism can reveal a lot of interesting emergent structure. I really believe that interpretability can be grounded by producing and fixing failures, as we saw in this talk, and I think that's really the way to go forward. And we kind of are showing that we can scale these interpretability methods. So again, this is joint work with my two great collaborators, Yossi Gondelsman and Alyosha Efros. And I'll thank you all and take questions.
Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for the talk. I did want to start off with the first question, which is one that we had written, but also an audience member raised a similar point, which is that interpretability methods in general rely on observing how the model behaves on certain inputs from a certain distribution. So for example, the attention head description vectors that you showed are dataset dependent because they're found by looking at the representations of some specific images. So one natural question might be, how stable are these types across different data sets, or even if you start to move to out-of-domain types of inputs, where not so out of domain that the model is not at all able to operate reasonably, but where the model is doing something meaningfully, but it's still different from what you had used to identify those particular vectors.
Yeah, so I guess first I should make a clarification. There's one way in which these vectors depend on the input and one way in which they don't. So the input tells us which directions there's a lot of variation in. So it's kind of telling us, okay, there's a lot of variation in this direction, but not this other direction. So I should like focus on explaining the direction that has a lot of variance. Once we've like identified that we care about that direction, the actual explanation of that direction does not depend on the input. Like it is just saying, okay, clip writes in this direction, and the closest text vector in the latent space to that direction is the embedding of this text T. So that part actually doesn't depend on the input at all. Of course, it does depend on these text embeddings being meaningful, so that's a different assumption, and I think there's probably important aspects of what's going on in the representations that don't that aren't captured by that. But it's not distribution dependent in that way, and I think that's important. That's actually one of like the main advantages of these kind of logit lens style approaches, is that they get around this distribution dependence by just like actually looking at like what is being written.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. So another kind of like related question here is like, I think in the talk you show a lot of interesting qualitative examples and also some quantitative analysis to verify the correctness or like the reasonability of the attributed regions for different properties. You are mainly doing that using, for example, retrieval-based ways or using segmentation. But something we're kind of curious to understand is like, what if the property you want to identify doesn't co-affiliated with an object? What if it's like a concept? How can you verify that? Have you ever thought of this kind of problem?
Yeah.
Let's say harmfulness is relatively hard to ground with a certain object. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think maybe I'd say a couple things. So in the pure vision domain, I guess most things you can talk about will be objects in the world almost by definition, because you can like take pictures of them. But I think once you get to the text domain, there's going to be much more abstract concepts. Now, actually, there are some somewhat abstract concepts that we already can get in the vision domain, like things of like textures or locations that might not like actually, correspond to like some very specific thing. I would actually say, yeah, so there's a few things here. I think there's like, is the structure of our analysis something that can get at these higher level concepts? And then separately, is like, the readout able to like actually read out the higher level concepts? So what do I mean by the second thing? Well, right, with CLIP, we can only read out things that CLIP can talk about. CLIP was trained on captions of images. That's a pretty diverse distribution. It actually does contain some abstract stuff, but it's probably missing things as well. I think I was in a talk recently where someone brought up a good example of like, there's certain like species of fungus that like it doesn't know anything about because it probably knows about visually, but it doesn't know anything about in the text world because like no one has like, you know, written captions about these species of fungus. So I think that's one problem. I think that is kind of a limitation that I think is actually a less big limitation than it seems like, but I think asymptotically it will be a limitation that we need to get around. The other thing is the structure, right? So one thing you might be worried about is that high-level concepts are not actually located in like individual neuron activations or individual directions in activation space. I think that's probably true. I really like recent work on things like function vectors that do kind of identify some of these higher level structures. So maybe I would say I kind of think the big future directions in interpretability are kind of like moving beyond linear activations to these higher level structures and also being able to decode more nuanced concepts. We obviously don't have all of the answers in this talk, but I think I'd agree with the question that those are where we want to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
I think you touched on this next question a little bit in your previous answer, but one natural maybe follow-up to this is to try to extend the method to work on different granularities. So maybe individual weights or all the way up to subnetworks or things like that. Do you see a natural way to flexibly parameterize this methodology so you could maybe operate on these different scales?
Yeah, so I think of that as, so I think a lot of what this methodology is doing is kind of figuring out how to like kind of decompose the model in different ways and like push information back through the model, right? So it's solving problems like the fact that, you know, these like indirect effects of just ablating something and seeing what happens don't necessarily tell you much of the story, and you want to really understand like what different components are writing. I think we're then basically just looking at directions in the activation space of those components because that's like the simplest thing you can do, and it gets you somewhere. But I think obviously in the long run you would want to go beyond these linear directions. But like, yeah, maybe I would think of that as like basically kind of orthogonal to these ideas, right? It's like you can push back to these like second order effects and other higher order effects, or you could go from linear to nonlinear, and those are just kind of two different questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think also towards the end of your talk, you mentioned a lot of interesting applications of your attribution results. So I want to ask a follow-up question on that. It's like something more related to the theme of our seminar. How do you see this interpretability or attribution work fitting in the overall picture of safety and also model alignment?
Yeah, so I think there's like a few things. I mean, one is you know, I think like a lot of the concern with alignment, at least, you know, assuming you're doing RLHF, a lot of the remaining concern is that there's kind of, you know, stuff going on inside the model that is not, you know, directly reflected in the outputs, but it is kind of important, right? Like maybe the model knows that its output is wrong, but it knows that you're not going to notice it, so it just says the wrong thing. Or it's making some like long-term plan that looks good in the short term, you know, these sorts of issues. And so I think, you know, to me, one of the ultimate goals of interpretability is to be able to kind of like read enough of the kind of thoughts of a model to be able to detect this sort of thing. I don't think that's the only thing, though. I think also that interpretability just helps much more with, or helps a lot with kind of just even purely behavioral auditing. The way I think about this is like, right, if I had like a computer program and I want to test it, if I can only run it and I can't read the code, I'm going to have a much less easy time testing it than if I can actually look at the code and reason about where I should be looking for test cases. And that's kind of what we're doing with this kind of like adversarial examples with the second order effects that I showed at the end. And I mean, you know, that might also uncover things like deceptive behavior, but I think like I guess I kind of think we probably can't anticipate all of the problems in advance that we need to worry about from an alignment perspective. And so having just this like very like broad kind of like top-down analysis tool that improves over like pure behavioral testing is probably just useful in its own right. So I think I'd say I see kind of like two reasons to care about it from alignment. And one is kind of this like very narrow reason around deception, and one is this like broader reason.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We received a couple of questions that are maybe a little bit more focused on the details of your work as well. So one such question is, what do you think the value is of zero-shot segmentation versus maybe other segmentation methods? And do you think that state-of-the-art segmentation is something that you could approach more generally?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you want the best segmenter possible, you should definitely like fine tune on the segmentation task. So I don't think this is gonna like replace state of the art like non-zero shot segmenters, but I see it as a kind of like test of whether we're kind of correctly tracking the model's kind of reasoning in some way. At least, you know, if we assume that as models get good, they're going to pay attention to the right parts of images, we should be able to use that to get good segmentation. And most of the other zero-shot methods I mentioned are also kind of trying to do some form of interpretability or attribution. So I think this is just saying like, you know, as an attribution method, this is actually working better than the other stuff out there. So I see it as kind of making this scientific point rather than like something that, you know, you would use if you were trying to segment stuff.
I see. Yeah. And here's another question from the audience. And basically, the person is asking whether the work also fitting the sparse autoencoders. Can you share more details?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of different from sparse. It's related but different. This actually came out like I think more or less concurrently with sparse autoencoders. So the right, like the similarity is that at least for text span, right, we're building this dictionary of concepts in the same way that sparse autoencoders are. Now we're encoding different priors, right? So they're just encoding the sparsity prior. We're encoding this like explainability prior that each of the directions should kind of correspond to some text explanation. And so I think those are kind of different structures. I actually think they're both pretty good structures. Like I think the ideal thing would be to have both of like sparse and explainable directions. And I guess, you know, one thing with sparse autoencoders is actually sparsity already gives you some explainability, but I think not as much as if you were actually like encoding that. You also kind of get, you know, these like text descriptions of the directions for free when you condition on explainability. But yeah, I mean, I think of them as kind of just complementary techniques. The other thing is maybe just what we were trying to do it for. Right, I think we kind of started with this like fairly big model rather than starting with the kind of simple 2-layer MLPs. Although I think since then sparse autoencoders have been scaled up quite a bit. So it seems like both methods are actually fairly scalable, and yeah, I think we should just be exploring both of them.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. More generally, I guess one of the points in your talk was also about how the method could be scalable to larger models and things like that. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what are the challenges with scaling today's interpretability methods to very large models? And do you think your method would face issues if dealing with like models with trillions of parameters or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this would probably be fine. I think actually the bigger problem is like I think this method like scales pretty well. It's then a matter of like how far back can you push the information? Because right now it's like mostly focused on the late layers. the network. So I actually think probably the like scalability issue is like a different one of just like how far back can you push things, and also like how fine-grained of concepts can you get. Yeah, the cost, I mean, you have to compute the activations for everything. I think once you've done that, I don't know, you'll see it's pretty cheap once you have the activations, right? Yeah. I think actually like the biggest cost is actually just running the forward pass of the model across your data set, and then everything on top of it is at least right now fairly cheap.
Yeah, I guess one follow-up question would also be about the scale of the capabilities that the model has. So if the types of text or the types of images that it can deal with are much more complicated and diverse, you might think that mining this descriptive set of hypotheses or ideas of what each attention head is doing, for example, would become harder. And analogously, like dot products with very, very high dimensional vectors could start to become meaningless or start to lose their their relative values may not be so meaningful.
Yeah, I'm less worried about the dot product thing because I mean we're already at like 1,000 dimensions. I don't think 10,000 is going to be like a huge difference. I think the first thing I'd be more worried about, or I mean, the way I'd put it is like, well, it's just like, 70 things is probably not enough anymore once things get bigger. And especially if you start adding sparsity, you probably need actually more than 70. So I think just like the number of concepts you have to find is going to increase. And I think it's definitely a computational cost. I think you might also get more interference across concepts. So that, I think that's also a potential cost. But yeah, I actually am kind of like intuitively less worried about that than just like going beyond linear concepts to more nonlinear concepts. I would expect these other scaling issues to be like things you have to handle, but like probably pretty handleable with the right engineering.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we also have many junior researchers in the audience. So here's a final question for you from them. How would you suggest researchers who are interested in interpretability to get started?
Well, I really like Neil Nanda's quick start guide, so you should check that out if you haven't already. I think just reproducing results from papers that you like is kind of one of the best ways to get started in research in general. That's kind of how I got started in ML research initially, actually, as an undergrad, is I just like found papers that I thought were really cool. And then first I made sure I understood them well enough that I could explain it to someone else. And then I kind of wrote code to reproduce the results and play around with them. So that's probably the best way to get started.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you again, Jacob, for the talk and for answering all of our questions. So that wraps up this session of the past seminar. Please follow us on Twitter, sign up to be on our mailing list. There are links on the YouTube for this. And yeah, keep an eye out for